Welcome back to the Fly Culture Podcast with me, Pete Titus. This is part 3 of the instalment with Pete Cockwill. I hope you're going to enjoy this one as much as me. It's been going down really well with people, so I hope you enjoy this latest episode. Over to you, Pete.
Welcome to part 3 of this strange thing of fish, people and places. Are you yet beginning to wonder about some of the oddball things I've got tangled up with, which haven't necessarily all been about fishing, but there we go. So what of this big estate I worked on and the events other than the fishery? Well, the estate owners became ever more involved with religion, and a very important place for them was the chapel on the bank of the Middle Lake. It was here that my daughter was christened, at the same time as one of their grandchildren. It was part of my duties to keep the chapel garden tidy, and when Mrs. Hutley decided to put on a nativity play at the top barn, Holly Barn, on the estate, it seemed inevitable I would be helping in some way. The early years of the nativity were a bit drafty and cold for the audience, but over time, Holly Barn evolved to be an amazing venue. One of the Hutley grandchildren would often be the baby Jesus, and the programme always featured a small flock of sheep on the hill outside, as well as the estate donkeys, and whatever other animals could be acquired on loan. My job was to organise the car parking for the people coming to see the performance. This was in the dark, often raining too, cold and miserable, on a sloping field, which was either deadly slippery mud or frozen hard. Either option made it tough, as the several hundred cars always had a few drivers who knew better and would try to turn and park pointing uphill towards the entrance. The exit was actually downhill and well signed. But Mr. Surrey four-wheel drive always knows better, at least until the road tyres on the super luxury vehicle don't work off-road. Over the years, things with the car park did improve, but the really cold nights were interesting, because the bigger vehicles would often move downhill of their own accord after they were parked. You see, after the majority were in, I would be stood by the entrance sorting the latecomers and the walking wounded. It was a bit of a stiff uphill climb to the barn. And then there would be a sudden crunching of metal and alarms going off. And seemingly, after the tyres cool and then the ground refreezes, the vehicle now slides on the frozen ground all by itself. A couple of tons of truck can easily punt a humble Volkswagen Golf, and sometimes there would be several vehicles in a bit of a mess, really. Anyway, as the audience came back downhill after the play, I would do my best to be extra busy directing traffic and not get involved in the arguments as to who was at fault. The downhill track, car park, perimeter and exit roads were always lit with flaming torches, and it really was and still is a magical night, especially for kids. In the early years at Wintershaw and before the plays, there was a really big outdoor wedding when their eldest daughter Charlotte was married at the Lakeside Chapel. Somehow that too involved me doing all sorts of preparatory work, including a smoking bonfire at one of the end of the lake to create a mystical atmosphere. Reception was in a marquee at the main house, and I had the final task to achieve as the happy couple left for their honeymoon in an ancient gold-coloured Austin A40. As their car went down the main drive, there were to be 2 exploding fireworks over the top of them. So, I had dug in the 2 cardboard launch tubes at the correct angle in the paddock next to the house, and come the moment, I slid the 6-inch bombs down the tubes and lit the fuses. Admittedly, I was a little bit squiffy, but I couldn't see that anything was happening, and the car was already halfway down the drive. I didn't know that these fuses burn internally with no visible sign, and as I bent forward to see if I could relight them, they went off in my face. Believe me, it's one hell of a banging flash, and I sobered up really quickly. My face was burnt, my new jacket was scorched, but the fireworks went off absolutely perfect as the car got to the bottom of the drive. Phew! Bit of a crazy life at times. Like the day I turned up at the main house as the owner came back with his dog, which had just been put down at the vet's. Bad timing on my part, as I now had the job of burying it in the pet's garden of the main gardens. There was an earlier burial duty when one of the elderly donkeys died while the estate owners were over in Australia. A telex message, remember telex, came through asking that I bury the donkey in the pet's corner. So, out in the paddock is this big lump, stiff as a board, with 4 legs sticking out. I had no hope of even getting it through the garden doorway, let alone digging a big enough hole. Time for a bit of lateral thinking. Dig over a big area of turf, sort of donkey-sized, then dig a decent spade-sized hole, cut off the tail, and put it down in the hole. Now, hitch up the carcass to a quad bike, tow it off into the woods, and use a couple of gallons of diesel to cremate the creature. Another interesting little experience. So despite periodic events which often had nothing to do with fishing, it was ever onwards. I continued to enhance the lakes with ever better platforms and edging to all the banks to prevent erosion. Problem here, you see, was the duck. Up to 2,000 of them in the great days of the shoot, because duck loved to puddle away at the water edge and would gradually erode the bank until it collapsed. Luckily, at the back of our cottage was a wood of sweet chestnut, which had been pollarded some 30 years before, and now it was 60-foot-high poles up to 10-inch diameter and perfect for timber. I cut stacks of it and split it lengthwise with wedges and then carried it down to the lakes. The dodge for the lake edges was to hammer in the poles along the edge, and then use the sacks that sand and gravel get delivered in to attach to the inside of the poles. Then backfill with dirt such that the sacking acts as a membrane, and within a week or so it's possible to walk on the edge as it all dries out. Bit of grass seed, and it left a real neat edge to the legs. Mind you, it took me many years to do, and I often wonder what it looks like now. The erosion along the dam of the middle lake was partially solved by a delivery of giant boulders, which I slowly, ever so slowly, with various levers, managed to get into position along the dam face and combat the effects of wave erosion. There's always a job to do when you get involved with running a fishery, and because I kept the banks regularly mown, it was seemingly very attractive to geese, who would then make a right mess of it with their copious droppings. I do remember a actually somewhat embarrassing event when I nipped down to the Chapel Lake early one morning to, sort out a bunch of Canada geese that were making an awful mess of the banks. They were very reluctant to fly away, despite some rifle shots onto the water. Subsonics make a loud crack when fired at water, so I thought I'd maybe best shoot a few to get the message over. Couple that with me yelling like some sort of idiot, and it all got a bit noisy. That's when I was mortified as the chapel door opened and a really nice man who had come down for early morning prayer peered out as though the world was ending. I could only apologise for having spoiled his moment of peace, but it taught me to check the next time I had designs on control measures. Back in the days of real winters, we don't get this anymore, do we? When the lakes would ice over, I had a bit of a brainwave when I wanted to build a new platform. The end was over about 6 feet of water, and really tricky to do single-handed. However, what I did that winter was to sit on the ice with a cold chisel and hammer and cut holes in the ice. 8 of them done, and then get the chestnut poles pointed and slid down through the holes, hammer them into the mud with a giant rubber hammer, and then chainsaw them off a few inches from the ice surface. Now fix the rails and the planking, and hey presto, perfectly level platform at exactly the right height above the water level. Without doubt, the biggest event for me all those years at the fishery were the one that Sue and I got married. She was always the one, and indeed we had been together at the lakeside family wedding many, many years before, without then knowing if fate would allow us to be together. Anyway, we did marry, at Guildford Registry Office, and without telling family. So we left it a few months before arranging a big party and telling the truth. Back then, at the main house on the estate, there was a lovely function room, which used to be the former stables, and where the annual fishing dinners were being held. We asked Mr. and Mrs. Hutley if we could use the facilities. Without hesitation, they said yes, and helped us so much. Indeed, just prior to the guests arriving, asked us and immediate family into the main house for a champagne toast. One of us, young Sue, was really nervous, and the chambers went straight to her head. She looked $1 million, and we had the most beautiful summer evenings to set things off. Guests were arriving, and the place looked fantastic. We hadn't let on to Sue's parents as to who was coming, apart from, of course, all the immediate family. The look on Sue's mum's face was priceless when Chris Tarrant and his wife Jane arrived. Then when Bernard Cribbins and Gary Brooker turned up as well, she was more than a little awestruck. It was a great evening, which my son Jeff filmed for it. When I was part of the way through my speech and mentioning everyone in turn, it was Chris and Bernard who chipped in with, "So when do we get paid for being here?" They're a bit of a smart pair, those two. It really was a memorable occasion. Our friends Walker and Carol Hughes from Oregon came all the way over. Indeed, we were in a bit of a tizzy because the venue could just about manage 50, and we had invited 70 on the basis that some wouldn't, of course, be able to come. Snag was, absolutely everybody said yes, and somehow we managed. These were great times. Peter and Anne Hutley were the owners of the estate at Wintershaw, and their enthusiasm, along with their passion, led to some amazing stories with their religious plays, rock concerts, and the fishery I was developing. The lakes somehow were a central part of the place, and inevitably I got involved in so many things which weren't really much to do with fishing. Peter passed away in 2024 at the age of 97, and his 2-hour funeral service in Holly Barn on the highest part of the estate was something I'll remember forever. Somehow we had an odd sort of understanding with regard to my work. Possibly it was pretty obvious I was constantly juggling my life to earn a living, raise a family, and somehow do a gazillion things on the estate, and he respected that. He was a man who expected results and had certainly achieved much in his life. When he became involved in the religious aspect of life, bearing in mind Mrs. Hutley initiated the nativity play, he went ahead full steam and wrote, directed and organised a wholly outdoor event called the Life of Christ. The success of that led him to then do an Easter special in Guildford High Street and a mega event in Trafalgar Square in London. Pretty amazing, really. However, the Life of Christ was set on the estate, with the final acts taking place around the middle or the chapel lake. So you might well ask, how did all this involve me? Well, a boat was acquired to be used in the scene for the Miracle Hall of Fishes, and it needed a bit of work. I made decking boards, seats, a mast and a sail. I fixed the leaks, painted it, and worked out some rowlocks so that the oars couldn't jump out. And a few old boats were also wanted to set other scenes, so I managed to find some at Lechlade Fishery, where my good friend Tim Small was only too pleased to be rid of them. That little job entailed myself and Jürgen Goff, our gamekeeper, driving up to Gloucestershire with a borrowed trailer and bringing the boats back to Surrey. So that was one job. Now, the main boat had to perform the Miracle Haul. The idea was to use a throwing bait net. You may have seen these on films of people using to catch little bait fish. And I managed to get one via my shop. After all, it was a fishing shop. And believe me, it's not at all easy to master the art of throwing these nets so that it lands on the water in a circle. I then had to teach one of the disciples who would be in the boat as it was rowed on the lake. Tricky, that one. So now, to make the scene effective, I used some old metal sheep netting as a frame, worn out net from a friend who commercially netted lakes, loads of rope and some cable ties to make a cage which would be under the boat. I then got some stock trout of around the £1.5 mark and put 20 in the cage. Now, you ready for this? So, the boat was rowed around the lake while a disciple threw the net. Jesus was on the lakeside and called out, "Have you caught any?" Simon, the disciple, then replies, "Nothing at all." Jesus then calls out, "Cast your net the other side." The disciple does this and then swaps the ropes over and begins to pull in the cage. As it breaks surface, the trout splash and go berserk. It's the Miracle Haul! and looks fantastic from the audience perspective. Then, and we weren't finished, the boat had to approach the shore, and Simon steps out to seemingly walk on the water and embrace Jesus. That meant I had to build a platform which was just an inch or so under the surface. Sound good so far? Well, none of the disciples could row for toffee, and suddenly I'm asked to wear a white singlet, white shorts, and do the rowing. This first year of the play, it was done at Easter, and it was a bitter cold spring. I did my bit, and believe me, I can really row. The miracle haul went well. I somehow struggled with the wind, got the boat in the right place for Simon to do his walk. Can you imagine how disastrous that would have been if Simon had stepped out and into 10 feet of water? I then had to bring the boat up the lake to the shore where the disciples could step out for the barbecue scene, while I had to sit in the boat and wait. All well and good, you might think, except I was so cold I was literally shaking. Oh yeah, I had to build the stone barbecue and put up nets on stakes as well to look like a fishing scene, and supply some trout to be cooked as part of the scene for the feeding of the 5,000. Well, that first year went off okay, except that trout don't do so well being dragged around in a cage, and after a few performances, it was a 5-day event, they were definitely the worse for wear. In subsequent years, I used small, sort of 1 to 3 pound carp, and they take being bashed around so much better, and indeed splash really well, so that was better for the performance. Happily, I didn't have to do the rowing again, and the underwater platform idea was abandoned. I caught the carp from various other ponds on the estate. Some years were trickier than others, but I did get quite a few on the fly rod in one of the ponds. It was very shallow and silty, such that by being really quiet I could spot the fish moving in the silt, drop a bloodworm pattern in front of it, and that was another one in the cage. This was all in the years before I really got into carp on the fly, but I always knew that in the real world they eat bugs and bloodworms. I've certainly never seen a hatch of boilies. The play moved to the summer months, so that on most occasions it was dry and sunny for the sometimes several hundred people who came to see it. There was a year when I got the report that the fish didn't splash much, so I went to check on the cage and found there was only one carp in it, but no apparent way the others could have got out. Somewhat puzzled, I then noticed a large number of carp scales in the grass and a burnt patch. Further checking in the fishing hut, I found that the scale pan had been used to cook the fish, and it was all black and burnt. Turned out some temporary employees thought it would be a good idea to have their own evening barbecue and use the carp. Temporary was just that, they were soon on their way. But that meant a frantic morning trying to catch some more carp to be ready for the afternoon performance. How come, when you really, really want to catch a fish, it seems almost impossible? Actually, carp were also in the trout lakes, but for a very different reason. Part of the vision for the estate involved there being a large white cross up by Holly Barn, and its purpose was a gathering point for those who believed they would be, shall we say, saved come the end of the world. These good people would need feeding, and that was the purpose of the carp. I used to put about 10 or 12 in each lake, and they would grow on in the bloodworm in the mud. I never fed them, but fish of a couple of pounds would typically be 5 to 6 pounds after about 3 years. And the lakes were routinely netted to reduce the numbers of roach and perch, which went off for stocking elsewhere, and same for those grown on carp. And then I would start off again with some smaller ones. Occasionally a carp would get hooked on the fly by one of the syndicate members, and almost always it would bring like a sort of semi-complaint that it was just a carp and not a trout. But if I asked about the fight, they would always heap praise on the strength of the fish. Carp do fight. They're really, really worth going fishing for on a fly rod. The netting events were always interesting, and it tended to be a mix of the guys from the Environment Agency, if they wanted some for restocking for a pollution incident, or my friends over at Godalming Angling Society, and occasionally a commercial netting group. I would drain the lakes down as best as I could, usually with a length of 4-inch pipe as a siphon. It's so much easier to do an effective netting with the water level down. can be a bit of a scramble at the last stages, as the fish need to get into the holding tank quickly or they suffocate in the mud. Muggins here managed to get in the way on one of the jobs and copped the end of a pole net handle which was being swung around. That gave me an amazing black eye. On the lower lake, I did once try just putting in 4 carp and left them alone for about 5 or 6 years. They did well with no real competition for the bloodworm and began to get quite impressively large. Eventually I made an arrangement where I caught each one of them on floating crust, popped them in a bin, and quickly took them to a carp water where they earned me a few pounds. They were lovely fish too, absolute pristine. Anyway, that was yet another chapter in my somewhat unusual fishing life. And it's true, I've tried many different forms and styles of fishing, and for a large number of species. And although we've talked about carp and things, I've not really covered all the other species that are fishable. There's some that really haven't done it for me, and there's others I actually don't even really want to try. For no good reason, other than that particular species or the style of fishing doesn't appeal to me. Having said that, I would really like to catch a barbel one day. They look great, and I'm told they really fight well. Hopefully one day, if I can ever stop work and get some more me time. Quite a few years ago, when visiting friends over in Oregon, I tried sturgeon fishing on the Columbia River. It's a seriously big river and can be 90 feet deep, so it's almost like sea fishing, and the gear is heavy stuff. The fishing regulations change frequently to try and keep a good head of fish in the water. And a couple of times, always fishing with friends, we had samples of the smaller sturgeon to around 4 feet or so. Twice I went out and tried for the bigger ones. These fish are very impressive, extremely old and very strong. They will often jump completely clear of the water when hooked. One year we were on the way up to Alaska and had a day on the sturgeon. This was with my pal Reuben Hook, and he had one that was estimated at 450 pounds. Alongside the boat, it was absolutely vast. My best that day was around 200 pounds, but as I say, the battle is awesome, and both of us pulled a muscle in our shoulders. That made it a bit tricky when we were up in Alaska casting the heavy sink tips for king salmon. I did one other trip for the big sturgeon. This time was with longtime friend Walker Hughes and a couple of his relatives. We took it in turn and each battled with fish in the sort of 150 to 200 range. Funny thing was that when the boat skipper said a rod signalled another fish, none of us wanted to take the butt pad to take on another beating. I can see why people enjoy this sort of fishing, for creatures that really, really fight back, but it's not for me. Maybe it's why I've never had any desire to go offshore for tuna, marlin, or any of those other monster fish. It's odd that sea fishing has never really bitten me. And although living just a quarter mile from the salt in my first 20-odd years, it was inevitable that I fished off the rocks and beaches. I never did get to go out in a boat from my home at Bude, but I spent a lot of trying to fool the mullet in the estuary. On the fly, they were a real challenge. Remember, this was the early 60s, and mullet had yet to become the revered British bonefish. I did catch a few on traditional wet flies, and my goodness, do they fight on a split cane rod and a simple reel, which really was my stream fishing gear. On breadflake I did much better, and I loved getting them on float gear. There's something about the float slide in the way that is sort of unmissable. Just once, before I left Cornwall at 20, I experienced what I've heard called mullet madness. There used to be a deepish pool below what was a weir behind the tennis courts, and it always held a school of mullet at low tide. Just occasionally I'd managed to catch a couple, often as the tide began to creep in. But this one time it was almost a fish every cast. I lost count after 40, and the next day tried again. The peak was gone, but I still had around a dozen, and that 2-day spell was by far and away the best fishing I ever had on mullet. Now I'm in my late 70s, and although making trips back home to Bude, I see mullet in the river that runs through the town. They're so much bigger than any I ever saw all those years ago. Maybe one day I just ought to try them again. Bass were another pursuit, and I was inspired by seeing these shining creatures hanging from the backyard door of my neighbour, Tony Guscott. He was an ace, and inspired me in so many ways. I've got to admit that I tried and tried to catch bass. Long hours with a lump of squid out in the third wave, cast with my Penn Beachmaster on a solid glass rod. My goodness, you learn real quick how to cast a multiplier, or you spend too many hours undoing birds' nests. Crooklet's Beach, the Breakwater, Sandymouth, Mullet, Widmouth, all those well-known surf beaches, and very little to show, for far too much time. Hours and hours in the winter months when the beaches were deserted. The very occasional schoolie, couple of pounds, if I cast into rock gullies, but never a bite off the surf beaches or the estuary. I did a bit better with spinning gear, but nothing of any size. My first wife's father had a boat at Rock, now the millionaire's playground, and we used to go out in the Camo estuary to feather for mackerel off Pentire Point. They were big mackerel back then, and supremely tasty, cooked on the beach over a driftwood fire. Sometimes we caught greater weavers, and very often saw poor beagles. This was before people used to target the shark, and indeed the record came from a little farther up the coast, and incredibly close to shore too. I well remember father-in-law winding in a string of mackerel, which was being followed up by this big grey shape, and that sort of put him off fishing out over the deep water. We used to try for bass off the Doom Bar on the way in, but it never happened for me. In subsequent years, somebody named a lager or beer after the Doom Bar. What a fabulous name for a drink, isn't it? That was a genius stroke. After I moved to Surrey, the sea off the south coast was quite different to the wild Cornish waters, and I had quite a few boat trips out from Littlehampton, principally fishing for black bream on light gear, and they were great fun. On one trip I got stuck into something pretty sizable, and eventually boated a 19-pound undulate ray. Very pretty fish. Going back into the harbour, we once had to wait offshore for the tide to get it right to going over the bar, and used the time to fish for bass. I didn't get one, but the chap next to me had a fantastic double-figure one, and then said to me, "Oh, is that a decent-sized one then?" You can see there's a bit of a pattern here, and I'm not destined to catch a nice bass. But I do like to try different things. Years later, and because I had made new friends in Alaska, it sort of came about that I should go out with them to fish for halibut. Mark and Susie Osland were very much living off the land and stocked their freezers with all sorts of fish and game to get through the long cold winters and be self-sufficient. I did a couple of trips with them out from Deep Creek on the Kenai Peninsula, and here the boats were launched off the beach with a tractor and trailer, then go belting out over the ocean to some deep water mark, where you would then lower down the bait using 3 pounds of lead. It needed that much to cope with the tidal flow, but even winding back in to rebait from 300 feet down is a bit of a marathon exercise, let alone what happens when there's a halibut on the end. These highly predatory flatfish are immensely strong, and I was told that if you hook a big one, then the last thing you want to happen is for it to break surface before it's really beaten. Apparently it then dives straight back down to the bottom and you start all over again. I only ever experienced what they call chicken butt, which are the fish up to maybe 40 pounds, but that was quite enough, thank you. It seems the big ones are usually shot before being lifted into the boat, because they're a bit of a handful and can easily cause injury until they're pacified. I really like to eat halibut and always enjoy a meal of it when in Alaska. My friends did actually let me try moose with them once. It was so tender you could cut it with a fork. I've had it a few times since, as well as reindeer, goat and deer, but what I can't stomach is seal meat. Oh God, it just doesn't do it for me. I don't have any aspiration to tackle a large halibut, but it's a special experience being out on the water, and I had a few trips just with the little ones. Those rich Alaskan waters will always give the opportunity to see whales go passing by, and without a doubt it's one of life's most magical trips to go and do a glacier and whale watching trip. I've done this a few times with guests, usually out from Seward, and would happily do it again. The cruise boat captain pulls up to the face of a glacier and says to everyone that he will shut down his ship, and he doesn't want to hear a word from anyone up on deck. Just stand quietly and listen. That's when you hear the creaking and the groaning and all the little pops and bangs as the ice mass slowly advances. It's very moving. I remember being on one whale watching trip with a couple who'd been taken by religion quite late in life, and how profoundly affected they were when a male orca cruised alongside the boat, turned on its side and directly looked at them. There's no doubt that it felt as though this magnificent beast was questioning them, and they went quiet for a long time. This was the same trip when they had a couple of their grandchildren with them, teenage lads. One went missing as the boat headed back to port, and a frantic search finally located him on the upper deck, fast asleep, sitting on the toilet, still with his pants down. That then meant trying to warm him up, so a cup of hot soup was doing the trick, which he then managed to tip into his lap. Now he'd burnt a delicate part of his body, so there was even more grief. Fortunately, he fell asleep for the whole of the train ride back to Anchorage and couldn't cause any more issues. I got all sorts of memories of Alaska, and my cabinet at home houses some odd things. There's the fantastic woven grass basket, which comes from Quinnahock, the carved grayling from walrus ivory, and another made from mammoth ivory. There's my certificate from Alaska Fish and Game for the state record grayling, along with some from IGFA for its world record status. One thing I never did acquire for myself was an oozik. I know you don't understand that word, so you can Google that one up and find out what it means. Oozik. There's only one Abel reel in the cabinet, and this was from the man who at one time had more than 20 on display in his shop. I only ever kept coloured Abels, and certainly had a reputation with people coming just in to see them, and then, of course, they weaken and buy one. Hee hee. Not my fault. All I did was put them on display. I did manage to go to the Abel factory when it was at Camarillo in California, and was real lucky to meet with Steve and Gina Abel. Then in latter years I knew Jeff Patterson too, and we collaborate on a couple of specials. One was to have the tail of a Strobel rainbow on the back plate, and that model sold well. I then wanted a grayling special, and got them to design one with the colours of the dorsal fin of the Arctic grayling. I had 10 of that model done, kept one for myself, gave one to my pal Lou for his limitless kindness, and sold the others. It's a beautiful reel, and I just look at it and have a little feel every so often, although I have used it a few times, especially chasing grayling in Alaska. Strange, isn't it, that I've been incredibly lucky to fish such far-off places for a wide variety of species, and yet it all started off with one of the most humble of fish from the canal right outside our home in Cornwall. The roach there were very special, and it's the one species of UK coarse fish that are so revered they will always rate as extra special when a big one appears. They really are beautiful, and those which live in clear chalk water will have the most lustrous blue sheen on their body, and their red fins are really distinctive. Back then in the late 50s or 60s, the canal had stocks of truly lovely roach, and with pretty simple float gear I used to catch good numbers on breadflake. A 2-pounder was not uncommon. The roach and some really good dace were popular for summer visitors, and I often wonder if they really knew just how special it was back then. As I said, our next door neighbour Tony was a first-class all-round angler. He got me into fly fishing when I was around 10, and really was a guiding light in my fly fishing life. He had an Austin A35 van and took me to sections of the upper reaches of the Tamar, the old original Tamar Lake, and lots of other places. It really was a great upbringing into all aspects of fishing. I really was very lucky to have a friend like Tony to get me into my fishing, and in this next episode I'll tell you more about the things we did and how my fishing life evolved from those early days down in Cornwall.
The Fly Culture podcast is brought to you in association with Fly Culture, a quarterly published magazine owned and run by fly anglers. When it comes to fly fishing, we've got you covered.